If everyone could please take their seats. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Jenny Martinez, the Dean of Stanford Law School. Welcome to this celebration of the 7th Annual Stanford Bright Award for Environmental Sustainability. I'd like to start by thanking everyone who is involved in making this event and award happen, including the faculty and students who served on the committee to select this evening's honoree. I also want to thank the Bright family, Ray's brothers George and Mike, and the family's longtime advisor, Alan. Thank you all for advising us on this award and for being here today. Ray Bright was the son of a park ranger and grew up loving the outdoors. His passion for the environment carried on throughout his life as he and his wife Marcelle made frequent visits to Yosemite, Death Valley, and other natural wonders around the world. A graduate of Stanford Law School's class of 1959, Ray had a successful legal career. He and Marcelle wanted to give back by supporting teaching and research on environmental law and policy, and recognizing people around the world engaged in sustainability efforts. In previous years, we've recognized and celebrated environmentalists from 6 different regions around the world. A social entrepreneur from Brazil working to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. A conservationist from British Columbia working to save the Great Bear Rainforest and create jobs for the coastal First Nations. The director of the Cambridge University Institute for Sustainability Leadership, who is training business leaders in sustainable practices. The chief programs officer of the Northern Rangelands Trust, who's working on conservation management and community development in Kenya. True entrepreneurs developing energy solutions at the grassroots level in Ukraine. And finally, 2 peace builders working together on water conservation and security in the Middle East. I know that this year's winner is just as worthy of the Bright Award, and to help you introduce you to her work, we have a video that I think you'll enjoy.
I have a deep connection with nature, and I've trekked in almost all the mountain areas in Pakistan. It was while I was trekking to the base camp of K2 that I finally realized that I cannot just enjoy nature without trying to do something to save the environment. The beauty of the area and the nature over here mesmerized me completely, but I was deeply disturbed by the waste and litter that I saw. So the first 2 years I mounted cleanup campaigns, but then I realized that was not a sustainable way of doing this activity. So I set up the Mountain and Glacier Protection Organization to engage with the area, with the community, and do something more sustainable and more holistic to preserve this environment. Climate change is a matter of deep concern for Pakistan. The country is a low emitter but has to pay a heavy cost in economic losses. Global warming is affecting Pakistan at multiple levels. We have more intense and frequent floods, rainfall patterns have changed, the number of hazardous glacial lakes has increased, agriculture is getting affected, and there's water shortage and more areas are becoming prone to desertification. Intense heat waves in the south are happening on a regular basis, and in the mountain areas, the trend of outmigration is on the rise, which is creating a new set of vulnerabilities.
Ray Bright had 2 goals in setting up this award. The first was to shine a light on someone who's doing important work on sustainability and environment, but who may not be well known outside their own country. And the second is to amplify the impact of that work. Aisha Khan is one of the most well-known environmental activists in Pakistan. In the aftermath of the 2005 earthquake, she led efforts to rebuild with 25 schools, 3 healthcare facilities, and really helping restore the community in those regions that had been destroyed. It takes a special person to notice an issue and then found not 1 but 2 organizations that address the underlying social and equity issues.
MGPO interventions in Gilgit-Baltistan largely focus on strengthening the adaptive capacity of vulnerable communities and ecosystems. Most of the projects that we have delivered have to do something either with irrigation, safe drinking water supplies, or protective walls.
In Gilgit-Baltistan, if you look at her contributions, I think she has done almost like 100 projects. And the most notable of that project is almost returning 90 billion liters of waters back to the nature and the communities. I was actually very impressed from her multidisciplinary approach. Whatever she did, she looked at the communities as well. She looked at disaster risk reduction, the environmental safeguards, the climate change impact, improving their livelihoods.
We work very closely with the communities and we organize them, and we make sure that this process is broad-based, it's representative, it's transparent, and it's inclusive, and it has gender participation. It helps to build a relationship of trust and mutual confidence.
Ayesha Khan has been working in the field of climate change and environment for a fairly long time. I believe it's been over 2 decades. Initially, she set up the Mountain and Glacier Protection Organization, and sometime in 2016, and I was part of the process when she set up the Civil Society Coalition for Climate Change. And in this way, she brought the whole civil society together in a coalition approach to deal with climate change in Pakistan, and I believe there are about 40 odd organizations which are working under the umbrella of the CSCCC.
I was convinced that if we adopt the coalition route and can mobilize civil society to brainstorm on policy issues together while respecting their autonomy and independence, we can carve out a role for civil society to become meaningful partners in climate action.
Because she has been instrumental in acting as a coalition approach. In this way, she has engaged top-level policymakers with environmental issues. This kind of approach, in which the civil society comes together with the government, with the media, with activists, is really the key to the future.
I would like to see Pakistan as a peaceful and prosperous country. Happily, things are changing. We have political ownership and we have a stronger commitment across party lines, with the government playing a very active role in conservation.
She has worked tirelessly to serve the unserved communities in the most difficult of terrain. She, I think, fully deserves this award. She is an asset to the world.
So as you now know, Ayesha Khan is an unparalleled environmental leader and activist. She's been working for nearly 2 decades to improve climate and economic resilience and advocate for gender equality in remote communities in ecologically fragile, high-altitude mountain regions of Pakistan. Her climate organization, Civil Society Coalition for Climate Change, or CSCCC for short, has facilitated collaboration among civil society organizations and the Pakistani government to help implement the Paris Agreement on climate change. Ms. Khan has continued her climate advocacy on the international stage by leading small teams of CSCCC members at the annual UN Climate Change Conventions over the past 3 years. Ms. Khan is perhaps most known, however, for her work in the Pakistan high mountain regions. As you saw, she's an avid trekker and mountaineer and established the Mountain and Glacier Protection Organization in 2001 after visiting the high mountain regions for herself. The organization was critical to the sustainable development of tourism in the region. It has built 6 ecologically sustainable camping sites along the access route to K2, the world's 2nd highest mountain peak, which is visited annually by hundreds of mountaineers from all over the world. The campsites also benefit local communities. They're managed and maintained by the people living in the high mountain regions. As you saw in the video, Ms. Khan has also expanded her mountain work to directly benefit and strengthen the resilience of communities in these mountain regions. In the aftermath of an earthquake in 2005, which devastated the community in Azad Kashmir, Ms. Khan led efforts to rebuild, equip, and run 25 schools, 3 healthcare centers previously destroyed or damaged by the earthquake. More recently, the Mountain and Glacier Protection Organization has focused on designing projects and raising funds for projects aimed at building climate resilience in the communities of the high-altitude glacier region of Gilgit-Baltistan. The work involves providing drinking water and clean energy generated by small hydropower plants maintained and managed by local communities. Throughout her career, Ms. Khan has dedicated herself to not only helping but empowering communities to address a future with climate change. For all these reasons, I am quite proud to present the 2019 Stanford Bright Award for Environmental Sustainability to Ayesha Khan. If you would please come forward. You will now have the opportunity to hear directly from Ayesha, and when she finishes, Buzz Thompson, the Robert E. Paradise Professor of Natural Resources Law, the founding director of Stanford Law School's Environmental and Natural Resources Program, the former Perry L. McCarty Director and Senior Fellow of the Woods Institute for the Environment, and the chair of the selection committee for this award, will invite our panelists onto the stage and introduce the discussion on climate change impacts on vulnerable communities. I'm delighted to introduce Ayesha Khan.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. It's such a great pleasure for me to be here, and thank you for joining me today to celebrate this success. Dean Jenny Martinez, the Bright family, the members from the advisory and the selection committee, distinguished audience members, and my family and friends who have gathered here today. Thank you all for being here with me. Getting an award and a recognition is always a great honor, and I feel greatly honored, and I think it's an honor for my country as well to be selected from the region for this prestigious award. Recognition is always a feel-good factor, but I think when it comes from one of the most prestigious academic institutions in that world, that feel-good factor reaches new heights of exhilaration. The Latin word for ecstasy is ecstatus, which means the soul experiencing something beyond the bounds of the physical. And I think that's the closest I can come to describing how I'm feeling right now standing here. There were, I know, a lot of people who were nominated for this award from several different countries. And I want to recognize each one of them because I think an award to one is a recognition for the entire community of practitioners. And I hope that it serves as an inspiration for everyone and sends out a message of hope, especially for the women, to persevere, to overcome obstacles, and to intensify their efforts in making a meaningful difference, because without the participation and active role of women in this, we are not going to be able to address the challenges of climate change that face us. I became an environmentalist by accident. 20 years ago, when I first trekked into the Karakoram region, I was driven only by my passion to discover the deep nature and to pit myself against its forces to test my own physical endurance. Few weeks in that brutal but magical landscape transformed my relationship with nature. I'd never had a transactional relationship with nature. I've always valued its healing and restorative powers over the provisioning and regulating services that it provides. But that first immersion visit changed everything for me. I realized that the human imprint on nature is very heavy, and the huge reliance that mountain communities have on ecological goods and services. Therefore, I returned just in 2 weeks' time as a committed environmentalist and decided to do something to preserve and protect that fragile environment. I've been going back into that region and I've been witnessing the change over there. And a lot has happened in the last 20 years since I first started my work. I'm speaking, to an informed audience, so I won't go into too much details about climate change, about global warming. But I do remember reading somewhere that in the concept of deep ecology, man and nature interact and they constantly modify each other. And if we want nature and man to thrive in tandem, then we have to strike that fine balance of harmony between human activities and nature. And I think my interface with nature, if it's taught me one thing, it is to strike for balance and harmony between human activity and nature. And all the activities that I do, my actions are guided by this concept. I'm going to touch upon a few things which are a matter of concern for me, and I would like to share my thoughts on that. When the Paris Agreement was made in 2015, it was hailed as a landmark agreement. And there was good reason to do that, because it was for the first time that 196 countries came together to agree on an agenda of solutions. And one of the things that they agreed upon was that we need to contain the temperature increase to within the threshold of the 2 degrees Celsius, with an ambition to reduce it further to 1.5 degrees. Now, in the meantime, last year, the Intergovernmental Panel, the special report that has come out, tells us that the 2-degree option is not an option anymore for us, and that we have to bring it down to 1.5 degrees. And I feel greatly dismayed because I see no sign of us moving in that direction. When the Paris Agreement took place, the parts per million of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere were 399.4. Today, they are 412. So instead of going down, we have increased. We will look at the remaining carbon budget available in the world. Instead of that budget increasing from 420 gigatons, it has come down to 350 gigatons. So that tells us that we're not really doing enough. And we need to speed up our act and do more. The second thing that is a matter of concern is the Intergovernmental Panel report on biodiversity and ecosystems. We humans, I think, have behaved very irresponsibly. And although some of the things we have done may be unwittingly, but now that we know, I think it would be unconscionable, it would be unforgivable if we don't change and mend our ways. We humans are responsible for putting at risk the survival of nearly 1 million species of plants and animals, pushing them towards extinction. And if we continue with the business as normal scenario, this number will increase and this extinction will happen in the next decade. So that is something to watch out for. And also, I think, to remember that we humans are also a species. And although we credit ourselves to be the most intelligent of the humans, of the species, we are working towards our own destruction. The third thing that I want to talk about is regional integrity. I come from South Asia. So as a citizen, as a woman, I'm of course concerned about what's happening in the planet and what will be the future of our children. But it's normal that I should be a little more concerned about the region where I live and how things are going to unfold over there. The Himalayan Karakoram and the Hindu Kush region occupies a huge cryospheric space, which means water in its frozen state. It's large enough to be called the third pole. Now, when you look at this HKH region, it provides the world indirectly with nearly 35% of its resources. Directly, it supports 240 million people living in the mountains and hills and about 165 million people living downstream. This region is also very important for us in Pakistan because it is part of the 10 large Asian river systems and the Indus Basin. Pakistan occupies 52% of that Indus Basin. And the flows in the Indus River, which is 3,500 kilometers long and is a lifeline for us, depends on 40% glacial and snow melt. So any changes that take place in the hydrology, in the flow patterns, are going to have a huge impact on us. And either way, it becomes a lose-lose situation for us, because if the flows are accelerated, we have floods, and we've had 30 floods in the last 65 years, including the super flood of 2010, which affected 20 million people. And if the flows are low and the timing of the water is not right for agriculture, we have drought and desertification. We are an agrarian economy, and we need to be mindful of that. Agriculture accounts for 20% of our GDP, and it engages 40% of our labor. So what happens in the HKH actually will affect the rest of humanity. It's not going to be restricted to the South Asian region. South Asia is also a very volatile region, and it's unfortunate, but countries like Pakistan and India within South Asia have a very dysfunctional relationship. And it gets better, it gets worse, but it's never as normal as it should be between two countries who are neighbors. Acknowledging that we have political differences and we have unresolved disputes, there is great urgency and need to have a partnership on environmental conservation and for ecological integrity. We share water resources, air sheds, ecological corridors, and that makes it imperative for us to cooperate and collaborate with each other. If we want regional resilience, we need to work together as a region, and we need to find ways, whether it is through science and society, to reach the policy makers, but we have to find ways to develop a system in which South Asia works as one bloc to protect its environmental integrity. I think most people who believe in science, and I'm one of them, have to acknowledge that we're living in the age of climate change. We're also going through a period of transition from a world of plenty to a world of diminishing resources. This is going to put vested interest groups against each other. And it's going to create demographic shifts, and it's going to also lead to societal strife. When you have less, there is struggle for more. I have a suspicion and a growing fear that this societal strife in the region will lead to violent conflicts. And to avoid that, we need to have ways through which we can have communication with each other and work closely with each other. I've worked, in the earthquake-affected areas, as Jenny Martinez told you, and I have seen the best and the worst of human nature. And the worst can be pretty ugly and unpalatable as well. One of the starkest examples that comes to my mind is the plane crash in the Andes, where the survivors were forced to eat human flesh to stay alive. So when you take that scenario to scale, I'd hate to think, what will happen in a world which has less, a world of scarcity and a world of deprivation. Human behavior will be very, very unpredictable. So we need to watch out for those things. The last thing that I want to talk about here is, some scenarios of hope. I know that, President Obama once said that we are the first generation who are facing the impacts of climate change and the last one who can do something about it. And I endorse that fully. But so does the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who says that small and incremental steps are no longer an option. We need to take big steps, and we need to find innovative approaches if we want to address the challenges of climate change. When we look at it from the perspective of social order, it is one that is a matter of greater concern to me, because I think that, social values are very important. What we teach our children, what we practice ourselves is going to make a big difference in how we're going to live in the world that is going to unpack itself in the next 20 or 30 years. Before I end, I would like to sum up some of the key messages that I want to share with you. The first one is urgency. We need to step up action, and we need to act now, and we need to act fast. The second one is about the protection of the species. We need to find ways in which we need to probably link human impact assessment, something along the lines of environmental impact assessment, to all development actions to make sure that it allows all species and life systems to survive and have at least an equal chance to live. The third one is social values. This, for me, is very, very important, because we can all live with less, but how we manage and respond to adversity, how humanity will respond to adversity, will largely depend on the values that we embrace and hold today. The fourth one is governance and the quality of leadership. Governance needs to be inclusive, And the quality of leadership also needs to send out a very strong message that we need to co-create policies, we need to have collective ownership for the agenda. If we don't do this, we will face many more difficulties than we imagine right now. For me, we are living in a world where we have done a lot of damage already to the planet. So some of that damage is irreversible, and some of those hardships are inevitable. But we have not yet reached that point where we can't turn things around. So, I am a naturalist first, and I'm an environmentalist second, and I am a social sector development worker third. So I take a very multidisciplinary, intersectional approach, which is more holistic in nature. So to me, climate change is not only about food, water, energy security. It is not only about hydrological imbalances and disasters or about health and productivity. It's also about social order and societal values. It's about how we practice democracy and its survival. It's about the emergence of a new political world order and populist leaderships that are pushing for an exclusive agenda. It's about the role and status of women in society. And above all, it's about peace and stability in the world. So we need to take a holistic approach. We need to take all these issues simultaneously. Because if we believe in one humanity and shared responsibility and prosperity that leaves no one behind, then every action from now on that we take has to be built on the principles of social, ecological, and democratic equity. Because without that, we will descend into a world of social chaos, economic meltdown, and face all the hardships that will be accompanied from collapsing ecosystems. So we can turn things around. It is doable, and we need to work together. We need to, I always say this, we need to work with a whole of society approach. We need to take everyone along. And one of the best ways for doing that, to me, is inclusivity. And I am a strong advocate for open government partnership, because we need to revisit the way we are practicing democracy today. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with OGP, but very briefly, this was a brainchild of President Obama, and it was launched on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in 2011. It's a very simple concept. It has 3 cardinal principles: transparency, accountability, co-creation. It started out with 5 founding members, and now that membership base has increased to 75 countries. It works very simply. All member countries have to make voluntary commitments, and they become part of a national action plan. You have to achieve those targets in 18 months, and then you make a new set of commitments. So this is a small and incremental way of achieving your sustainable development goals and moving forward. And for developing countries, I can think of nothing better than to have measurable progress that makes you set targets, achieve them, and then move forward. Otherwise, we're very good at making policies which sit on shelves, and we never really do anything to implement them on ground. So these are some of the things that I wanted to share with you. The award, I recognize, brings a lot of prestige and recognition with it, and I intend to leverage that to generate new ideas and to find innovative approaches, because there's nothing more powerful than a good idea to attract crowdfunding. And one of my aims will be to start an endowment fund that ensures the sustainability of both the organizations. It will build our capacity, and it will also give us greater freedom to meet the emerging needs of the people without being bound to donor-driven projects. So that is going to be one of my aims after returning from here. MGPO also happens to be a 501c3 registered organization, so I'm hoping that in the US that will help me achieve my sustainability goal. My work is very rewarding and I find the outcomes most gratifying, but I think there's nothing more soul satisfying than the warmth and joy that family and friends bring in your life. So I want to thank my husband Aziz, who's always been there as a pillar of strength, always encouraging me to pursue my passion. My sons Jamshed and Amir, who take great pride in my work and who always encourage me and motivate me to do more and to do it better. I want to thank all my friends and colleagues back in Pakistan who've always been there with me to support and encourage my work. I want to thank Shafkat Kaka Khair. It's unfortunate that he could not be here with us today for personal reasons. He is my guide and my mentor and my friend, and I'm especially grateful to him because he considered my work worthy of nomination and nominated me for this award. He also happens to be, one of the most knowledgeable persons that I know of in Pakistan on environment and climate negotiations, and I have benefited enormously from his rich experience and his vast knowledge. I want to thank a lot of people, Molly, Stephanie, Priscilla, Amy, Taylor, so many of them who were in touch with me over the past months, helping me prepare for this moment. Thank you so much. And if I've forgotten any names, please forgive me. In the end, I'd once again like to thank the Bright family. I'd like to thank Stanford for bestowing this huge and exclusive honor on me and giving me this wonderful memory that I will cherish forever. Thank you so much.
So as Dean Martinez mentioned a little while ago, I'm the head of the selection committee here at the law school. And every year, as you can imagine, we have hundreds of nominees for this particular award. And so when we finish the process and in consultation with our dean, we make our final decision, we always are a little bit worried, did we make the correct decision this year? And after hearing Aisha Khan, I know for sure we made the correct decision. That was an extremely informative, inspirational, and gracious acceptance speech. So again, thank you for all of the work that you do. So one of the great things about this award is that not only do we get to honor somebody from around the world who has really taken the idea of sustainability and put it into practice and helped to promote it within their particular region and to inspire others, but we also get an opportunity to have a panel discussion on a topic of relevance to the particular award winner, where we've included some of our own experts from here at Stanford. So if I could get all of the panelists to come up and take your seats up at the very front. And Aisha, that includes you again. So I will be very short on the introductions. I'm not going to repeat people's titles because if you look at your program, you'll find out exactly who each of our panelists are. But I will tell you very briefly that Marshall Burke, who's all the way on your far left over there, is an economist by background. He's one of our rising stars here at Stanford. And Aisha, one of the things that you mentioned in your comments was you were really worried about, in the light of climate change, where might human behavior go? And I can tell you that Marshall has the answer to that, and it's not a good answer. So one of the things that Marshall has been looking at is what is climate change going to do to society? And in recent pieces, he has shown that climate change is going to lead to greater violent armed conflict around the world, to higher global economic inequality, and even to higher suicide rates. Our other addition for the panelists is Gabriel Parodi. And Gabriel just started this year and is another one of our rising stars at Stanford, also working in the climate area. Gabriel is, her background is in risk perception and communications, and in the same way that Marshall looks to see what climate change is going to do, Gabriel thinks about how can we potentially solve that. So she's looking at how you can use risk decision science in order to try to build resilience into society and to promote sustainability, particularly in various developing nations. And our panelist, just like for the last 2 years, is Greg Dalton. You can see from the program that he's the founder and host of Climate One, and every year I make a pitch for Climate One. If you are interested in climate issues, Climate One does a weekly broadcast, radio broadcast, on public radios around the United States, and it is the most informative program that I know in this particular area, and they also do a monthly television show in the same area. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Greg to lead this particular discussion.
Well, thank you, Buzz. It's great to be here for 3 years in a row. It's an honor to be here. It's such a well-presented and distinguished group, and excited to talk with you all, so welcome. Aisha, you mentioned women's empowerment and got some applause there. So I want to ask you, when you were you're an urban woman, going into rural, male-dominated villages, you connected with the women first. Tell us how you were able to do that, to build trust, to do what you did.
Okay, I didn't connect with the women first. It took me almost 8 years to connect with the women. I connected with the men.
Maybe it would have been shorter if you did, yeah.
Because if I had gone and, with the gender agenda and tried to connect with the women first, I would have probably been chased out or had to do a lot of firefighting. So I chose not to do that. I chose first to go and interact with the men, deliver project benefits, let communities see, and then impose my condition of 40% inclusion. So that 40% inclusion was after 5 years. And now it's
40%
inclusion of women in decision-making bodies. And now it's part and parcel of our methodology. And communities know very well that if they want any support from us or any service delivery, they send their women to us, because that's the surest way for them to get a project.
But when you first went, we saw in the video a couple of times you were wearing we saw, urban Aisha and then different Aisha. Tell us how you kind of moderated your dress to be acceptable to the local culture.
That took me a couple of years to do that because, like I said, I went in as a trekker. I was not an environmentalist. I was not working with the community. So I would put my trekking gear and go in there. But when I started working to build the adaptive resilience of communities, I realized that I have to respect their cultural sensitivity. So I started modifying and covering your head and wearing longer shirts, etc. I still am not completely conservative, as you have noticed in the way that I dress when I go into the communities, because I feel it has to be halfway. I'm meeting them halfway. They need to meet me halfway as well, because total appeasement is not a good idea. So I'm just doing enough to let them know, yes, I respect your cultural sensitivity. You must accept the way I am as well. So it's working out very well that way.
Gabriel, you work on decision making in communities, and I'm interested in the way decisions are made and how climate is affecting the way that decisions are made by cultures who have people who read the sky versus look at climate models, and how climate might be destabilizing some of the way traditional communities have made decisions in the past, because the past is not a predictor of where we are.
Yeah, so I've done some research in Costa Rica in an area called Guanacaste, and the time that I was doing research there was severe drought occurring. And so the rules of thumb, or the heuristics that people were using, and we talked to a variety of different people, so small farmers, all the way to people who ran irrigation districts, to utilities. The rules of thumb that normal, everyday people were using to make decisions about when to plant, what types of crops to plant, were no longer reliable. So for example, people would rely on a bird coming at a particular time of year to make a decision about when the rainy season was going to come, and it stopped showing up. And these individuals that we were interacting with in these communities would often use other sources of information to inform their decision making that weren't, on my team we had hydroclimate modelers working with us. We're like, just give them climate models, we'll totally get that and we'll use that information. But these individuals were using folk science, basically, individuals saying something to the effect of the first 12 days of the month of January is going to indicate what the rest of the year is going to look like. So if the first day of the month is rainy, then the rest of January after those first 12 days is likely to be rainier. So how do you bring climate science information and translate it into terms that are trusted, credible, and usable? And so that's some of the work that we did using co-production techniques and also working with boundary organizations, so organizations that are on the ground working in the communities to translate that information into usable terms.
Right, trusted messengers, which I think what Aisha had to become a trusted messenger. It took you a while to get there. Marshall, how is this affecting, this is going to affect rural development around the world? Tell us about how rural development is going to be impacted by climate. Some of the things that were tried and true in the past might not be viable in the future because of climate destabilization.
Yeah, great, thanks. So some of the important channels were already mentioned. So agricultural productivity, we know agriculture is a sector that depends very heavily on what happens with the climate, and has, as already been mentioned, many different agricultural systems around the world are facing a lot of change, and most of that change, particularly in the tropics and the hotter parts of the world, is negative. So we know that crops are less productive when it's hot and when the rains fail, and the climate models tell us that in many places that's likely to get a lot worse, right? So I think agriculture is a key part of the story and a key sector that could feel negative impact. Importantly, though, it's not just agriculture. So we and many others have done research suggesting that we shouldn't just be thinking about agricultural productivity when we're thinking about the impacts of climate change. So our labor productivity, even here on Stanford campus, goes down on days when it's really hot, right? This has been shown for workers like myself. This is shown in manufacturing plants. Right? People doing jobs that are very different than folks working in agriculture, right? So I think we now, and especially in the last few years, have clear evidence that it's not just agriculture that will be affected by hot temperatures. So I think there's an important rural development story, but it won't just be the rural sectors that are likely to be negatively affected.
And there's one study that found that there's an optimal temperature range for productivity, which happens to be kind of Mediterranean climate, which coincides with Silicon Valley, perhaps. So tell us about that and how many places there are and whether those places might see more migration to them or... Yeah.
That's right. So it might seem a little crazy that there's a global optimum temperature. And, of course, we don't know exactly what that is. But the idea is intuitive, right? If it's really, really cold, it's hard to be productive economically. Similarly, if it's really, really hot, right? We don't see a lot of productivity in the Sahara, and we don't see a lot of productivity in Antarctica, right? So the perfect temperature has to be somewhere between Antarctica and the Sahara, right? So there's some optimum temperature where we just do really well. And it turns out, if you look at the global data historically, so if we use 50 years of economic output data from around the world, we find that optimum temperature is, and this is an annual temperature, it's about 55 or 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And it turns out, what's the average annual temperature? So this is night and day, winter, summer. Average annual temperature of Palo Alto, California? 55, 56 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Right at that global optimum, right? And it doesn't depend. You can drop California out of the sample and you still get the same number, right? So it's not sort of mechanical. So, coincidence or not, we live in a very comfortable temperature, and it just turns out we're very productive at this temperature. So what happens as you warm the climate up? We start pushing ourselves off that optimum, right? We start getting a little warmer, and maybe a lot warmer by end of century. So if history is any guide, what that says is we're going to be less productive, right? And those productivity impacts are going to get larger and larger as we go into the future unless we figure out a way to adapt.
Aisha, I read recently in Time Magazine did an extensive issue for Climate Week, and I read about, I think it's a town called
Jacobabad.
Thank you. Potentially the hottest place on Earth, registered 124 degrees recently in Pakistan. So it's kind of unfathomable. At some point, humans are not able to perspirate, and there's a band beyond which humans, are not able to live, and that must be getting pretty close there. So tell us about just the searing heat as we're in the optimal place here in Silicon Valley, but stretching the ceiling in Pakistan and other places.
Jacobabad is and has been for the longest time the hottest place in the world. This year, the temperature hit 53 degrees Celsius, which I don't know, translating in Fahrenheit.
Only the scientists in this room know what that means.
But it's only a small example of what's going to happen in South Asia, because the new report that has come out by the World Bank recently tells us that the lives of 800 million people will be at risk from climate hotspots in South Asia, and 10 districts fall in Pakistan. So what we're going to have is massive outmigration and mass movements of population who will have to shift because survival will be impossible. And I think globally also the projections, if we continue with business as usual scenarios and reach the 3 Celsius temperature increase, about 74% of the world's population will have 20 days in which they will not be able to work. So it's not only the global south, it's the global north also that's going to get affected.
And one study found recently that for every day above the normal range of days, above I think it's 90 degrees, it's like lighting a $20 bill on fire for every person in that area. And that's just for every day above the normal number of days at 90 degrees. So it has direct economic impacts. Gabriel, what do we know about who leaves in these situations and who leaves when? Migration, is it the people who are really wealthy leave because they can go to New Zealand first on their jet, or is it the people? Tell us who leaves.
Yeah, so some of the work that I do is related to sea level rise and the impacts of sea level rise in coastal areas, specifically in the US Gulf Coast. And research in that area suggests that the people who leave are those who are kind of younger, middle income, have places to go, so they have a community that they can go to. And the people that stay end up being the very wealthy, because they can afford to armor and protect themselves, and they can afford to have the resources available to them. And also the people who end up staying are those who have nothing. So those that are kind of at the very, very bottom of the income ladder and are the most vulnerable.
Right, which is kind of what we've seen in New Orleans and some other places.
Yeah, so in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and Rita, that's kind of what we've seen. And actually, New Orleans is an interesting case. The demographics have shifted to be much more affluent and much more white in a lot of regions of New Orleans, which is really interesting. So that particular city has lost a lot of its diversity that it once had.
And if you look at Detroit, where climate migrants are going internally, Detroit is a place that's kind of gentrifying, and because there's water, there's affordable land, Detroit's on its way up, and that's a place where people are going to. Marshall, what do we know about more migration, and let's get your take on that migration, who leaves and where they go, and how that can be relate to economic development. Some countries might say we're going to industrialize and try to keep people here, or industrialize and get them wealthy so they can stay.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I would say the scientific literature is still sort of figuring that out. So we do see very clear signals that when you get extreme weather conditions, hot temperatures, droughts, you do see migration. Internally, this is often desperate migration, so this can be the poorest who just literally have to leave because they have no other way to support their families. Much of the international migration actually tends to be folks that have enough income to be able to move, right? So we saw that very clearly in Syria. You saw a lot of the Syrian middle class, even wealthier Syrians, leaving Syria, going into Europe, right? These were doctors, lawyers, very well-educated folks. You also see that in other international migration settings. So I think you really have to think about whether these are long-distance migrations that actually require some capital to be able to make it work, or internal migrations. And so when you look in these camps for internally displaced people, these are typically not the wealthiest. These are typically desperate, poor families who have no other way to survive.
Marshall, what are some ways to make accommodations, lots of air conditioning. What can be done, to protect workers, right? Make greenhouse gases worse by, air conditioning in place. But there are places, there are, UPS warehouses that are not air conditioned that will soon be air conditioned because they need to be.
That's right. So yeah, we can think about specific adaptations like air conditioning, and air conditioning is actually really important. It's been shown to mediate or reduce a lot of the temperature effects we see in places like the US. So the impact of hot temperatures on mortality in the US has actually gone down dramatically in the last 50 years. And most of that has been attributed to the fact that we can air condition our buildings and make them pretty nice to live in. Now, can we do that everywhere in the world? Can societies afford to do that just monetarily? What impact will that have downstream on the climate? These are the important issues we need to grapple with. But we will need adaptations like that going forward, given the amount of climate change we're likely to see, as Ayesha pointed out.
Ayesha, we hear a lot about resilience in the climate conversation, and that's kind of a big fancy word. I don't really know what resilience means. What does resilience mean?
I think to know resilience, you need to first identify vulnerability, and then you can talk about resilience. And vulnerability to me has always been a very difficult word to describe because it has so many elements attached to it. I think the place where you're born, the country where you're born, the family into which you're born decides your vulnerability. Then you go to your geographic location. The small island countries are more vulnerable because when the sea level rises, they'll be the first to get impacted. The economic strength of any country makes a difference, and within that, I think the per capita income and the income and wealth divide between the rich and the poor also determine resilience and vulnerability. The population growth rate in every country is very closely related to resilience or vulnerability. And then the role and status of women in society makes a big difference, and the governance patterns and structures. So if we move towards resilience, you have to work on all of these, and you need to see that your population growth rate is arrested. Sir David Attenborough has come up with two very simple solutions to meeting the challenge of climate change. He says, stop being wasteful and correct your population growth rate, lower it. And if we do just these two things, I think it'll make a huge difference. So vulnerability, is created. Some of it is due to the policies that countries follow themselves. And I've always said that do not confuse environment and global warming. So many things that we in Pakistan can correct ourselves with better governance. We tend to blame everything on the outside world, but global warming is happening. Yes, those climate change impacts that are affecting us unfairly, they need to be addressed by the development world, because mitigation is not our problem is adaptation. And we need close to $7 to $14 billion per annum to meet the adaptation costs, even if we have to shift to or transition to clean economies or low carbon emission economies. So our resilience will improve once our population growth rate is reduced. It's 2.4%, which is unsustainable. If we have better governance and we empower women and we give them a better and greater role in society, and when the income and wealth divide between the rich and the poor is reduced. So these are some of the factors which I feel directly have an impact on creating vulnerabilities, and when we reduce them, automatically the resilience factor goes up.
So empowering women also keep a lot of that as part of keeping girls in school, allowing them to stay in school. What kind of cultural openness or resistance is there to that right now in Pakistan?
Two things, the transition from primary to middle is not very good, and from middle to high is even lower. We have barely 22% of the women engaged in labor force. A lot of the women who are working in the agricultural sector, but this is non-monetized labor, which means they don't get an income and therefore they do not have economic resilience. So we need to work on that, and we need to
change that. We need to empower the women more, and we need to encourage them to have more places in decision-making forums. So we're working on it. It's a slow process because socially we are a conservative society, and I think culturally we are rooted in age-old customs and traditions, and it's difficult to break these barriers. It doesn't happen overnight, but there is a change. Like, I'm different from what my mother was, and I don't have a daughter, but hopefully my son has one. She will be more emancipated, more evolved, you know, more dynamic.
No pressure.
And the social media is changing all that, because now globally the world is connected. You know, when I work in even the remotest areas, it's so heartening for me to hear young girls who are in 10th grade or 11th grade say they do not want to marry and settle down. They want to now empower themselves, have a job, and be a source of strength and support to the family, and not forever be a dependent and called vulnerable. So that's a change that I'm seeing, but it will take time.
Can everyone hear her? Make sure. Yeah. Okay. All right. Maybe a couple. Okay. Aisha, you mentioned some of the hope for future funding. How have your work so far been funded? Did you have to rely on philanthropy? Was it government money? And were you invited to make bribes in distributing some of that money?
No, luckily no bribes, because, you know, people know that I'm not going to do that. No government funding.
You wouldn't admit anyways at
no
Stanford Law School if you
no
did.
philanthropy support. It has entirely been donor driven. So we have to look out for requests for proposals, and we need to match them with the kind of work that we are doing. And it's mostly been from foreign donor organizations, except one Pakistani umbrella organization that works for poverty alleviation. The rest is all the European Union and different embassies and USAID funding and UK funding. And we're constantly looking for different funding sources. We apply, and when we get lucky, we're working very closely with the Global Water Challenge. They are regulars, so with them we have a certain security that every year when we complete one generation program, we go into the next generation. But for the others, you know, it's all up in the air. That is why for me sustainability and the endowment fund and moving towards, you know, self-reliance is so important.
And is it true that fundraising is your least favorite part of the job?
I've never done one, actually. I'm just counting on, you know, this recognition and the prestige that comes with this award to leverage that and start that activity for crowdfunding and creating the endowment fund. Because, you know, my skills are in working with the community and in developing and implementing projects, but not really in fundraising.
Marshall, water is a way that a lot of people will feel climate, and it's a very, very localized, obviously key to agriculture, economic development. We're seeing there's water whiplash. We're seeing too much water, not enough water, pushed to the extremes. How's that going to affect agriculture and economic development? Because there's just going to be floods to droughts to floods to droughts.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's going to create a lot of challenges, both in a state like California that's, you know, has very sort of industrialized advanced agriculture, and in other parts of the world that have a lot less water storage. So here we can buffer that a little bit because we're able to store water either above ground or below ground. Other parts of the world can do that as well, but it becomes increasingly challenged if you don't have the sort of means for storage. So yeah, I think it's only going to add to the productivity woes of agriculture, unfortunately.
And Gabriel, you study risk. A lot of, you know, water management. It's about, is it going to rain tomorrow? Do we keep water in that dam? Do you know how people are changing their thinking and decision making about, well, you know, should we save that, recharge our aquifers, or can we suck that water out today and worry about next year? Because there's a lot of risk that goes into how to use water.
Oh, that's a challenging question. So if I think back to the work that we did in Costa Rica, it kind of depends on the actor. So there was...
institutional actors different than...
Yeah, so, you know, for example, with aquifers, there can be a lot of different institutions who are in charge of oversight, but then you might have a lot of different users who may or may not be digging illegal wells. And so it's difficult to manage freshwater resources like that, and kind of when people have different competing goals, and for example, for some individuals or for some communities, it's just pure survival. We need the water now. It's hard for them to plan for the future. and to kind of have that long-range thinking.
Right, and your risk if you're a big institution is different than if you're just a small farmer. Your risk is very different. Marshall, the trade and tariff wars that are going on right now are changing trade patterns, and soy is not being exported from the U.S. to China, so China is getting it from the Amazon, and that's a driver for some of the deforestation that's going on there. How are some of the trade and tariff patterns that are happening now affecting rural development, because it's changing global trade patterns?
Yeah, that's a great and I think deep question. They're being changed a lot. For an academic, actually, Trump's policies are sort of an amazing research opportunity because trade policies are changing so quickly and so fundamentally. You have an opportunity to measure the downstream impact of those changes on a lot of things we care about. Now, obviously, it's not a good thing. It's creating a lot of hardship for a lot of folks. In places like the U.S., again, we're resourced, and soy farmers in the U.S. are suffering because of the tariff, but we're then cranking up support in other ways. So many of them are going to come out maybe okay. That's again not going to be the case in less resourced countries that don't have the means to support their farmers in other ways when the tides turn against them in terms of trade. So. All economists would agree that on average, freer trade is better if we have these systems in place that can help support the people who are harmed. And so in some countries we'll have that, and others unfortunately not.
Aisha, you talked about regional cooperation. I would like to dig in a little bit in terms of your work, whether you reach across that India-Pakistan, volatile relationship that you mentioned, because last year we were here and people heard of people working in Israel, Palestine, and Jordan, using the environment to bridge some of those divides. Are you doing that with India?
We're trying to do that. We're not directly talking to scientists or society in India, but when the relationship improves a little bit, we are hoping to reach out. In the meantime, we have this regional forum, EC Mode, the International Development Organization for Mountains Communities in the region, and they routinely invite member countries. So all of South Asian countries or the SAARC countries, the regional cooperation countries, and we get an opportunity to discuss issues with society as well as with scientists. And recently I was at one such conference, and it was very, very educational for me as well as very productive, because we met with scientists, and it was between science and society. And scientists are apolitical people. They just rely on empirical evidence, and they conduct research, and they come up with their findings. And civil society also, I think, is looking for a broader collaboration. So when science and society talk to each other, they in fact can become that bridge that can start influencing policy, because policy in itself is driven by political agendas, and it's very difficult for them to change or have an appetite for change without push from society. So I think society needs to be informed by science, because whatever I am doing, I'm doing it in a much better way now because I follow science and I find out what is happening. Because if I don't, then I will not be able to educate the communities and get them to understand what is happening and how they need to change their behavior and production and consumption patterns. So these dialogues and these collaborations, when they start happening on a more frequent level, then I think things will change.
And how about water is so critical. You talked about the water towers of Asia and how many millions of people are dependent on the water. Do you see future conflicts over that water? Because the flow of it is going to be less predictable, and that's part of what your projects have done, is to kind of make more predictable that water flow. But where does that go if people start getting anxious about their water supply downstream from these hundreds of millions of people?
Yeah. That's why I said that the potential for violent conflict is very much there, because right now when we look at the HKH region alone, about 16 billion hectares of land is supported through irrigation, which benefits about 300 billion people, 3 billion people, sorry. So when the water supply shrinks itself, then
then the upper riparian country will want to use that water for its own people to meet its own needs. So it's not like anybody will deliberately stop your water, the sources will shrink. So water will become a very critical issue for us, and I think for the lower riparian country, it makes them more vulnerable. Therefore, it's best to start thinking about how to have shared objectives. And that is why I'm so keen on collaboration and cooperation, because if you have better relationships with countries, you're able to manage these challenges in a more humane manner. But if you are hostile and antagonistic, and your relationship is predicated by prejudices and other negative considerations, then the response will also not be empathetic.
Marshall, Buzz mentioned in your introduction that you foresee, sort of conflict at both, I think, the individual level, state level, et cetera. And is that true as temperatures rise? And what do you think about what Aisha just said in terms of stress over water? Is that what we're going to see? And where are some hot spots that you see?
Yeah, so I think the data, the empirical evidence bear what Aisha just said out, unfortunately, very clearly. So if we look historically, and we can look at many different types of human violence. We can look at large-scale civil conflicts that we still see, unfortunately, in many parts of the world. We can look at smaller-scale interpersonal conflicts, violent assaults or murders in the US. And we see a very clear climate signal in these. We see all of these go up as temperatures increase. Now, do we fully understand why that is? I think often we still don't. The interpersonal link might just be because you get hot and you get a little pissed off or angry, and a few of us are likely to be more violent, right? It doesn't take too many of us. On civil conflict, it likely has to do something with dwindling resources and altercations over those resources. But the historical data show this very clearly. So that would suggest if we don't change our ways, right, this is going to get worse as the climate worsens. But here I think actually, and again, the academic research, so I'm a dorky academic, so I'm just going to appeal to what I know, which is the research here. But the research provides some hope. So there's actually nice examples from South Asia, India specifically, when they rolled out a rural employment guarantee scheme. Basically, they said, when things get bad, we will guarantee you a job and a living wage. When they did that, they basically broke the link between climate and conflict, right? So they were able to roll out basically this social safety net. You saw no more in these really bad years or really dry years, you saw no more conflict, right? So to me, that suggests that there's a huge role for government policy and for social safety nets, and again, the sorts of protections we need for people in reducing some of these really bad things we might otherwise see.
Any bright spots that you see, Gabriel?
I was just smiling when you were talking about interpersonal conflict. I think some researchers would suggest that it has to do with people also just being outside more and just greater opportunity for crime and violence. Some psychologists have researched this. I think it's pretty interesting.
Sitting outside on the stoops and then something starts.
You're outside with your friends, going to get some drinks, and then,
what could go wrong?
Do I see some bright spots? Yeah, I do. So actually, some of the work that I do in China, in Sichuan province, where we're talking to communities in rural villages that have unconventional shale gas development occurring there. And we ask them about their views on development, about energy, about greenhouse gas emissions. And we also ask them about the future. Do you think that getting water is going to be harder and getting access to clean water is going to be harder? Do you think that air is going to be more polluted in the future? Do you think that a host of things there in terms of what the impacts are likely to be? And by and large, these people that we're communicating with are saying, yes, things are going to get worse. That's kind of what we foresee in the next 20 or so years. And then also, interestingly, we don't necessarily see them thinking that unconventional shale gas development is a bad thing. So that's kind of what we're seeing when we're testing the barometer of where people are. However, I am very heartened by what's happening around the world with our youth. And we're seeing a really, really strong growing climate youth movement, which is really inspiring. and young people coming out and testifying and saying, this is my story, we're owning it. We're seeing hundreds of thousands of kids, just leading the way basically on this topic. And so I feel hopeful for the future. We look at our young people and also our young, strong women and girls who are actually stepping up and being leaders in this movement.
Aisha, you have eco-anxiety, I know. Are you also hope? Do you see hope, or are you see a darker?
No, I feel optimistic, because hopelessness sets in when you have no other option. I feel that right now we haven't reached that point. We still have certain options, and if we mend our ways, we can turn the clock around at least. And I agree with you that I'm also counting on our youth. We have the Fridays for Future, we have the Extinction Rebellion, we have people like Greta Thunberg.
Who, by the way, would say, I don't want your hope. Like, you fix it, don't you dare. She was pretty clear, like, don't wait for us, you fix it.
So, we feel that, her generation is watching us and we can't afford to let them down. But more than that, I think there is now a universal consciousness about climate change, because we are reaching that point where all of us are feeling the impact. So whether we are believers or non-believers in the science of climate change, we can see its effects, we can feel the difference, and that will force us to do the right thing at the end, because the instinct for survival takes over at some point.
I think we have a mic for a couple of questions. We'd like to include you. So if there's we have them there. So let's please, the microphones in the aisle, one there and one there, if you'd like to.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My question has to do with the conflict in Kashmir, and I'm wondering if the Kashmiris have any equity in climate sustainability. I think you mentioned something about the Kush in different regions, but I know that we see here conflict in Kashmir, and I'm wondering how that can be resolved as far as environmental sustainability.
That's a very political question. I'm not a politician. But in terms of environment, whenever there is conflict, it damages the environment. And when the environment is damaged, inevitably it affects the lives and livelihoods of people. So if this continues for right now with the shutdown, if people are not going out and doing their jobs, it's affecting their lives. And when the water resources also shrink or the hydrological imbalances happen, that will also affect their lives. So whether it's the conflict in Kashmir, or whether it's conflict elsewhere, or whether there is no conflict but climate change and global warming is happening, I think it's going to affect people. So I think if we put humanity at the center of our conversation and say it's not about countries, it's about people, then our approach will change, and that's the approach that we need to take. We need to think people first and about politics and political agendas later.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next question. You're not in line for a question? Okay. Here we go.
So, Ayesha, thank you very much for all the work that you do, and for coming here and talking about that to us tonight. You mentioned that you're a naturalist first and an environmentalist second. Can you talk about what the difference is and why you put being a naturalist primary over being an environmentalist?
A connection with nature is very different from actually working for the conservation of the environment. And I feel that I'm a naturalist first because from childhood, as far as back as I can remember, I've always enjoyed nature, and I felt that you are spiritually more elevated and you draw strength. I draw actually physical strength, and I have more mental peace and stability when I'm in a natural environment than when I'm in a built environment. The environmentalist in me was awakened after I saw the degradation of nature. So it was really to protect nature that I started doing environmental conservation work. So what started for me as a trekking adventure turned into
environmental conservation work, and then into building adaptive resilience of people. And after the 2005 earthquake, I included the disaster risk reduction into my portfolio. And now I think 20 years later, for at least last 5 years, I look at everything through the lens of climate change.
Thank you.
I recently interviewed David Wallace Wells, who wrote the book, The Uninhabitable Earth, and he was, you might think of that as an environmental book. He's a New Yorker who says, I don't really have an attachment to the environment. He was motivated by data, and so there's a person who's not a naturalist, but kind of got to the environmental part through another portal. Let's have our next question.
Hello, my name is Raymond White, and I have a question and a comment for Marshall. The less trade we do, the more it's depressed, the lesser our footprint on the planet. Okay. Second, what do you have to say about population shift from the third world to the first world, which takes people from a low impact environment to a high impact environment, both in Europe and the US?
Well, other panelists should jump in on this. The trade question is interesting. It depends on what we want to eat, right? If we want to eat bananas, growing those domestically actually is either impossible or has a larger climate cost than bringing them in from somewhere else, right? So the math on that is actually not so simple, and for a lot of consumption goods, trade is actually beneficial for the environment relative to trying to produce everything locally. So that would be my economist answer. My economist answer to the second, and as a development economist, I think we fundamentally care about the livelihoods of people, and I think Aisha put that front and center in everything she talked about. So if people are able to migrate to the US or to the EU or to a wealthier place and have much higher incomes, that's a good thing. And migration is actually one of the largest inequality reducing things we know how to do, right? So in that sense, I think it's a really positive thing. We do consume too much in this country, and so I think that, to me, is a problem we need to deal with, but we can't deny that people's ability to come here is going to improve their livelihoods.
I'd just like to jump in and say that I think we need to change our production and consumption patterns, and we need to change our behavior. We always look for technology and for innovation to maintain our present lifestyles. That is not possible, and I'm all in favor of producing local and consuming local, because that's what that environment, that ecology supports. So that is what we should do. We should not be thinking of eating bananas the whole year round.
Okay.
I have a comment about migration, and so this is relevant to the United States, but perhaps we can think about this more globally as well. Some research has been done looking at migration due to sea level rise, finds that in Florida, there's a lot of in-state migration, so people are going to be moving in-state, but where people are likely to go based on historical migration patterns is Atlanta, Georgia, and Phoenix, Arizona. So when you think about what these two regions are going to be like in terms of temperature, in terms of water resources in 20 or 30 years, we have to think and plan accordingly for where people are likely to go and what resources infrastructure we have in place to support the people that are going to be coming. So I think it works on kind of both sides.
This question is for Aisha. Could you explain a little bit about the geography? I know Gilgit and Baltistan were mentioned, and you talked about the Karakoram range, but I've also read in the papers that what they refer to as the third pole means the entire Himalayas. That includes the Tibetan Plateau, everything. So if you could just explain a little bit about Gilgit-Baltistan, maybe, just the geography, because I'm a little unfamiliar with that.
Okay, the HKH, I always give the K to Karakorams because those are the mountain ranges where I work, and that is where K2 is, and that is the mountain that actually transformed me. So the Himalayas, Karakoram, and the Hindu Kush, they're the three mountain ranges in South Asia, and they are what you have called the third pole, because they have the third largest repositories of ice outside the polar regions. So it starts at the upper end from Tibet and it comes down down, but what happens at the upper reaches has an impact on the lower reaches. So there is shrinking of glaciers. There is some talk about the anomaly of the Karakoram Glacier, that they are actually surging, but that is not really true because the number of glacial lakes over the last 5 years has increased in the Karakorams as well. So the upper ablation glaciers are more stable, the lower ones are melting at a rapid pace.
Got to look out for those anomalies, like the extent, we hear that the extent of sea ice is expanding, and that's true. If you look at the sea ice is expanding, but it's thinner and there's less of it, but it can be a talking point. Oh, there's more of it, so you be very careful. We have to wrap it up there. Let's give a round of applause to these three fabulous guests. And Aisha.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Is the end of this evening's program. There are a lot of people to thank. I'm going to do it very quickly. I want to thank our fantastic panelists. I want to thank everybody who's involved in actually making this award possible.
Hey, Buzz.
Excuse
me 1 second. We overlooked someone that I think that, I'm sorry I didn't see.
Right.
Given how much, given the gray hair in this room, we're not going to let it go out without a, yes.
Well, I was wondering if you have specific examples of what young people can do to improve climate change.
What can young people do to address climate change? What can young people do to address climate change?
You're asking us? Yeah, I mean, it is the young people who have to do everything, really, because because they have to come out there and, you know, they need to make noises. They need to make loud and persistent noise, that this is our future that you're playing with. And, you know, what kind of a world are you going to leave us behind with? Is it going to be a barren and thirsty world? Is it going to be riddled with disease and starvation? Or is it going to be the same quality of life that you have enjoyed? So I think the youth movement needs to pick up momentum, and the more pressure it mounts, I think the greater pressure it will have. And as soon as this young generation becomes eligible to vote, that is when they will start changing policy, because they will bring leadership into politics who will put environment first.
A recent study that just got published, and it shows the power of children in changing their parents' minds. So I think talking to your family, talking to your parents, taking individual actions which in aggregate can make a big difference and shift social norms is really important. So children are very powerful.
All right, sorry about that. Yeah. Sorry about that. Everyone was pointing. You forgot.
That was critically important. So just again, I just want to end by thanking everybody who's involved in actually putting this award together and choosing a great award winner every single year. We have a selection committee, which is actually a majority of students. We have consultants from the region who both help in identifying people to be nominated and then evaluating the various candidates. And then we also have an advisory committee which is made up of several members of the Bright family and others. Everybody is instrumental in putting this together. So I just want to thank everybody involved in this award.
Yeah, thank you.
And with that, it's an evening. We will be back again next year with another award winner. Next year is the Far East. So if any of you know of potentially great award winners in East Asia, please let us know. Thank you very much and have a great evening.